Hi, I'm Mina Malik Hussain and you're watching The Coffee Table. So today we have a really interesting show for you guys, and I like to say it's because the A-team is on set. Because I love me a pun. So what we're doing today is we're talking about our urban spaces. And urban spaces are really important because urban spaces and the way that cities are formed and the way that cities take shape around us have a really interesting and really significant impact on how we interact with cities and each other. And to shed more light on this and sort of talk to us about Lahore's unique architecture, we have got Attiq Ahmed and Ayesha Sarfraz, who are both architects and Attiq is an urban designer. More on that.
Good reading.
So hello, welcome to the set. It's really great to have you guys.
Hi.
Hi. So Attiq, tell me, what does an urban designer do?
Well, an urban designer basically designs the spaces and experience of a city. And that can include the volume of buildings, the height at which they are to be in relation to each other, how many trees there should be in a public space, what sort of seating or lighting there should be. All of that is basically the job of an urban designer.
Okay, that's really interesting because I feel like the word experience here really interests me, because whenever one thinks of an architect, it sort of almost sounds only like you make buildings and it's just that, you know, there's an office building or there's a house or just some kind of building, and then that's what architects do.
I mean, that's a bit reductive.
I know. I know, which is why we're having this conversation.
All right, yeah.
So Aisha, tell me, what is sort of, it's really just an experience of a city or an experience of any space. So there's so much that goes into it then, obviously. There's light and there's trees.
There's
and
sound, there's smell.
Wow.
So say, for example, you know, Port Grand in Karachi, which is so nicely done.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the very seductive smell of sewage sort of every so often wafts right through. So not exactly a very nice experience, but everything that you walk into, the studio, the hospital you're born in, the school you go to study in, these are all environments, designed spaces. Some of them work well, some of them don't. What do you think, Ayesha?
Yeah. So how does a space that works well, do you think that's a sort of space where all of these elements are coming together in a way that the person who's interacting with them doesn't even notice the design that's gone into it?
I mean, they always say that good design is something where you actually don't notice that the design is actually there. It's only when something goes off that's when you realize it. I agree with Attiq that space is all about the sensual experience. Like you should, you know, the tactility of it, the smell of it, the feeling that you get when you enter a space, whether it's a big space or a small space. Like, I mean, that adds to the experience that's...
So that shouldn't be discounted, like a visceral reaction to a space. You know, when you walk in and the place is light and it looks really beautiful and it makes you feel happy to be in a space. So it's not just, you know, feng shui
I think
energy.
That's key, what you're saying, the feeling that you get, right? Like, you should feel happy in a space, or you should feel uplifted. Like, that's all calculated by the architect, or should be calculated by the architect when one is designing the space.
The sort of idea that this can be manipulated and it's something that you can create.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's almost like set design.
Absolutely, because I mean, I've always kind of believed that space affects behavior.
Absolutely.
So whether it's aggression, whether it's, you know, some sort of mood or love or whatever it is, I think the way that the space is designed definitely defines that.
That's really interesting, because if we take it on a sort of macro level, where we have cities, and sort of my understanding is that old cities such as Lahore, for example, sort of urbanization happens in a kind of organic way, where cities, you know, they expand outwards, people move. We started with, for example, with Lahore, we started with the walled city and inside those 13 gates, and now the city has expanded and the sprawl continues. So there's a sort of, it feels like it's organic and it's not really extremely planned.
Well, the thing with Lahore is that it's gone through several planning cycles. So the most sort of obvious being the colonial sort of parts of Lahore that we still navigate and use. Because the older parts of the city, such as the Mughal urban fabric, other than the monuments, very little actually remains. The city, the inner city rather, The footprint of that entire settlement actually dates to a pre-Mughal time. The walled city of Lahore being unique in that this is a pre-Mughal footprint that the entire sort of settlement sits on.
Okay.
But other than the footprint, I mean, I was shocked when Ayesha and I were working together. We used to actually go into the walled city very late at night or very early in the morning. Now, in the day, we would go there and it would be completely overwhelming. You know, smell, sound, too many people,
traffic,
all of that. Now, if you
human
saw
traffic jams.
yeah, we got
You
stuck
couldn't
in
move.
human traffic jams, if you could believe that. But so if you saw one jharoka or one tiny wall bracket somewhere, you would just magnify on that and take it as a signifier for the entire kind of experience. But you go there late at night, it's a slum. Most of it has been gutted. Havelis have been, turned into plazas. Azam Cloth Market and Pakistan Cloth Market, Akbari Mandi, all these sort of wholesalers have pretty much taken the entire city hostage.
Oh.
Well, we actually studied this for a number of years and concluded that actually Lahore's walled city's problems could be solved by rebuilding a wall around it.
Really?
I know that sounds so strange.
No,
right?
how fascinating. That's so cool. I love the idea that you sort of reclaimed the space literally by just sort of re-establishing that boundary.
But what we did was we borrowed the idea of a wall, but actually made an 8-kilometer long building that encircled the entire city.
And was the original wall like that as well? It was any sort of a space where you could move around inside as well, or was it just a wall?
Well, there were two walls. One wall was the Mughal wall, and the other wall, the outer wall, was the Sikh wall.
Okay.
And both the walls were demolished.
So the gates, the 30 gates, that's part of the Mughal.
Yes.
All right. And so then outside of that wall is the Sikh wall,
That's
which
right.
presumably then Ranjit Singh or...
Ranjit Singh's time, I believe. I'm not 100% sure of that.
But the gates that we have right now were reconstructed by the British.
That's
if I'm
right.
not mistaken. Yeah.
They were all destroyed during the British-Sikh War in the 19th century and then rebuilt like the Diwan-e-Aam.
Right.
Now, the idea behind the wall was that you reclaim the space between the old and the new wall, which the British did by making a garden, which we then encroached on and built several bazaars. But the idea would be to take these encroachers, take all the wholesalers, move them out, literally square foot by square foot, give them new sort of bazaars inside this wall.
Okay, so you're not pushing them out with no plan, but you're just organizing the space in a way that everybody benefits from.
Yeah. Just sort of organizing its schematics better, improving the experience, as it were.
I mean, I've always understood this wall as an infrastructure. It's reinterpreting what a wall is. It's not just a boundary anymore. It's something that houses functions, people, urban activity. And then you're missing the best part of it, which was like during Basant, there'd be a promenade that's on the wall that would just become like a public space so you can fly kites there, thereby resurrecting again the age-old
and
tradition
again, the
of Basant.
functionality sort of then ties in with the people who live in that area and the sort of traditions and the culture that we've almost always had. I love the idea of a promenade. It would be a safe space where you could fly your kites, not fall off. It could be regulating, it would be sort of high,
Absolutely.
high railings,
banisters.
safe for families.
The entire building's facades would be vertical gardens on both sides.
Wow, how would that work?
That would work beautifully because you have basically a concrete jali on both sides, a screen that allows you to have this sort of airflow through and through. But what you do is you have vertical sort of vegetational elements sort of introduced.
So just sort of growing on the wall.
Absolutely.
Ooh.
Which would also cool the air that would pass through the building and greatly sort of oxygenate the environment, which used to be fields but is now brown fields.
Yeah. I mean, there used to be a river also, and now there is no river. All sorts of things we'd love to have, but no longer do. Oh dear. So the vertical garden sounds really beautiful because it would be green, it would help sort of contribute to everybody's good health, it would improve the environment, and sort of coming back to what Ayesha said about spaces influencing how we react to spaces. So crowded spaces, human traffic jams, would obviously, it would be a stressful environment. And it's actually really heartening to think that those kind of like microaggressions on a daily basis or sort of ghettoization of certain areas, which lead to, again, their own set of social problems. And these are things that can be addressed just by planning the space better. And I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think if urban planners and designers would just move towards a more inclusive and more contextual planning models as opposed to, importing models that don't necessarily apply to the city. And you haven't studied the city, you haven't studied the users, you haven't studied, the functions, the local functions that happen within the city, which actually include all sorts of classes, from even street vendors.
Yes.
There's no space for that. The new big avenues that we've created with underpasses and overheads, like, no one's thought of about what happens to the gada gadi that goes there.
Yes,
you
or can't cycle up that bridge. You can't cycle up any
how
of
do you
those
deal with
bridges.
these?
I've
But
tried.
actually, Ayesha, I'm very intrigued. The project that you and Arsalan actually worked on, the one that got published abroad.
Right.
And weren't you guys looking at how the city spaces were getting affected by security apparatus?
Yeah.
Security apparatus. And I just want to take a quick break here and we will come back to this because this is a fascinating conversation, so don't go away. Hi, welcome back to the coffee table. We're talking about how urban spaces affect us as people and how certain sort of terribly planned spaces can make bad and aggressive people. It's just that simple. Just be in a better space.
Basically.
I'm being so facetious, but it amuses me. So tell us about this project that Attiq has mentioned to us.
Well, so my colleague Arsalan Rafiq and I, we've kind of been working on the city of Lahore, as we always have, and we're noticing how securitization is how that's affecting urban design now.
So can you tell us what securitization means?
Yes, absolutely. So securitization is basically all the nakas that you see, all the barricades that you see, all the walls that you see that have gone up from 3 feet to 12 feet high with barbed wires and metal detectors and snipers and, all sorts of apparatus that you can imagine. I think all these things, they kind of just happened over time, and there was actually no planning involved in this.
Right, because at that moment it was
at that
like
moment
a
it was needed.
Basis
so if it had to happen, it had to happen overnight because there was the need of the city to protect itself. However, it's gone to the extent where it's really affecting the city now. What it's done is it's fragmented the city.
Yes.
So you've got these islands in the city that have become inaccessible. The cantonment, for example.
Yes.
Or
GOR, for example. Like both enclaves had multiple entrances and exits, and now I think it's been limited to maybe 2 or 3 in each enclave.
And there's a great deal of philosophical theory about this as well, that fear becomes a factor in sort of ghettoizing areas.
Absolutely.
That then people want
fear is a selling factor.
So people inside those areas want to just keep other people out because they're just afraid. And for the fabric of a city, what does it do to the psyche of citizens when you're in a city, but like you're in GOR, scared of everybody outside?
Examples like Sao Paulo or Mexico, Bogota, Medellin. We've seen this story unfold before in developing countries.
It's nothing new. It's been happening all over the world. And I think the first and foremost thing that happens is xenophobia for me.
Yes.
That means it's the fear of the other. You only want to hang out with people who look like you, who talk like you. Suddenly somebody who doesn't look like you has become like he's the outsider. You don't want to engage with them.
And sort of more than that, you're afraid of them.
You're afraid of them, right.
Your interaction with other people is being limited by the structures in the city that are actively keeping you away from other people.
There's social profiling happening. You can't say that it's not. So when you're going through a barricade, if you're a girl, there's a different treatment. If you're a boy, there's a different treatment. If you if you look a certain way, if you don't look a certain way,
If
I'm
you
not
come
going
from
to...
a certain economic sort of background, where you can be messed with, you will be messed with. If you look like you shouldn't be messed with, you won't be messed with. It's not actually equal anymore.
Yeah.
And that actually begins to degenerate the social fabric of a city. The other becomes fully entrenched as the other.
And I think that is incredibly important, because in times of danger in a city, instead of people coming together as citizens to kind of
they start fearing
support
one
each
another.
other. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that fragmentation is alienating, and it can be solved by design.
It can be like, for instance, when we were working on the Orange Line route, we went to a neighborhood called Kapurthala House in Anarkali. And now the residents of that neighborhood were echoing the sentiment that Anarkali is the heart of Lahore and we are the heart of Anarkali.
Right.
How can you rip the heart out of this entire city? So when we investigated on site, looked at the entire train route, etc., it could have just been moved.
Just diverted around it.
Just around. They could have changed the construction technique. Instead of using soil nails, they could have actually built a more expensive retaining wall. And that would have caused less damage to the surrounding buildings. Now, Kapurthala House was one of the best, most interesting neighborhoods I've experienced in Lahore. And they had this incredible relationship with the shrine of Mauj Darya. And every Thursday, it was an informal kind of a drawing room where the residents of the neighborhood would just assemble. Kashmiri chai is being served. People are doing kavali somewhere. Men, women,
and
everyone
it's just an open
sharing
space where anybody can come in and anybody can leave. And there's nobody's asking you what you're doing there.
Yeah.
And why are you here? And that's a very it's something that feels very familiar as a Lahori.
Now,
to have those places.
You see, now I want to be clear and say that it's not that one is against public transport.
Of course
We're one of the largest cities on earth. We need it desperately.
Yes.
Yeah.
But not transport that destroys the fabric, both social and physical, of the city. It should actually complement the city and the different spaces.
Yes, and in fact, the design can move with the times, and then cities evolve over time. And there's so many cities that we go to abroad as well, and they are just as old.
Or older,
In fact,
even in some
probably
cases.
younger than Lahore, because Lahore is one of the OG old cities of the world.
Right.
And they've been able to develop public transport, and they've been able to do it in a way that hasn't affected the heritage of the city.
But Ayesha, do you think that the city is also being forced to just grow too far?
I think
That's
so.
interesting. Yeah.
I think so, because the city's kind of been expanding southeast.
Quite right.
Yeah, in a very haphazard manner.
So it's not as planned as one feels.
It's not as planned, and
looks.
I've always kind of felt that the modern planning has been done in patches, and there's no kind of connection or cohesion there.
Don't you feel it leapfrogs over existing settlements and villages and
absolutely
leaves those people out who've been living there for centuries or decades or for a long time, shall we say.
Which goes back to the initial idea of how all these planners are kind of superimposing plans that aren't actually ground up, but they're coming from the top down, so they just land onto the city. It's instant city.
Instant city in the worst way.
That's what you do. It takes 2 minutes and suddenly you have something.
Boom. So there's a blueprint.
Well, I mean, you take out the residents that had been living there, so you can make something shiny and new.
I mean, there's a reason why instant soup is not as nutritious as Mum's yakhni.
Done from scratch.
Yeah.
So what are the kind of things that we need, sort of environmentally and culturally? And I keep saying culturally because we live a certain way, we cook a certain way, our weather, the vagaries of our weather are a certain kind. So as architects who also design people's houses and offices and those sort of practical everyday spaces, what are the things that one has to consider for efficient and sort of sensible spaces? Not this kind of imposed. You can't take a model home from Finland and then just plonk it.
Or Pinterest.
Onto
as
Facebook.
everyone-
Pinterest.
Oh, Lord.
which is the new
Oh,
thing,
goodness.
right? Yeah. I mean, you look at the topology, you look at the orientation of the sun, you look at the weather, the climatic conditions, you look at the social conditions.
But
You look
Ayesha, I
at-
was wondering, like when we talk about contextual design, you know, I was debating this with the interns at the office. Like, what sort of context do we even mean? Is it something that is physically present somewhere on or around the location we're building on? Or is it something more abstracted, like a sense of using red brick in Lahore or yellow stone in Karachi?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of gels with the feel of an area.
But as an architect or as sensitive designers, I think these are all layers to your architecture that you need to add. You need to be attuned to the fact that there's a certain material within your domain that you can use in a particular way, because there are techniques and then there's materials. And I feel like that same sort of sensitivity applies to planning as well, because you're right, we do live in a particular way. So whatever house you're planning, you have to understand how this particular family operates, you know, in this particular sort of culture, in this environment with this much rain or this much sun.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you don't do that, then, I mean, I think what you're making is, again, you're making instant houses.
It's not responsible.
No, they
it's
consume
not.
more energy. They are, you know, short lifespan, badly built, leaking sort of, you know, little brick boxes.
Right.
Yeah, and I sort of have noticed over the sort of past 10, 15 years, a lot of the houses look the same, brick boxes. And what I personally find interesting about both your aesthetics is that it's quite modern, but it's also sort of taking into consideration all of these ecological and sort of geographical concerns. Like, you know, you like to do a lot of jalis, for example.
Yes.
And for me, a jali sort of, it reminds me of verandas in old houses. But the veranda is a very useful feature to have. It keeps rooms cool. It helps with ventilation. You can sit there when it rains, you know, when there's no electricity. You can sit in your veranda, but you have to have one first.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Well, I think actually a lot of the vagaries, first of all, can be addressed through a simple checklist. Is the house going to leak during the monsoon? Is the house going to be ridiculously crazy cold in the winter?
Yes.
Is the upstairs even livable in the summer?
Yes, is it a blazing furnace? Which it
So-
often is.
And so as an architect, wouldn't you say, Ayesha, that perhaps we could just start off with this checklist
Yeah. As a
basic kind of...
and then build upon it with whatever you're building.
You know,
or
like in
whatever.
older houses, one had skylights up in a high ceiling, and don't see those anymore. And they were very useful for letting out hot air. All you do is sort of just pull a rope, and the hot air would just whiz out.
Yeah.
So how do we do those things? There's a whole sense that, you know, being modern and wanting a modern house and a modern lifestyle means that we've sort of just given up all of these really practical, sensible old
I
things.
don't completely agree. I think modern is, the word is used quite loosely.
Yeah.
And the sort of modernism that I think perhaps Attiq and I are responding to is more of a regional modernism, where we're understanding what sort of conditions that the houses should respond to. And especially in Pakistan, where there's a lack of electricity, there's lack of gas. I mean, the inflation is like through the roof. So how do you build and manage a house that can take all of these like conditions into
and sort of-
consideration?
And to me, that's a really sensible, practical house.
It is.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that it's modern in a bad way.
Yeah.
It means it's just modern in a responsive and responsible way.
And responsive to our current conditions now. Things have changed for us, and you know, it's getting hotter, it's getting rainier, it's getting weirder, it's getting smoggier.
Yeah.
more humid and
Yes.
Yeah,
that's the biggest problem I'm having with like inappropriate architecture. How do you deal with the humidity? The sun, the rain, you can figure out. But the humidity, I mean, we just don't have the tropical breeze.
We don't, yeah.
Quite right. And more on this, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some projects that these two have worked on. We'll show you some pictures. It'll be fun. Don't go away. Hi, welcome back to the coffee table. We're still talking about urban design, and this great conversation is making me want to build a house now. So, guys, tell me, people don't have gardens anymore and understand that there's a lot of times you just don't have the space for it. But there also seems to be this hysteria about trees and leaves are messy, so just pave everything. And what is that? What kind of architect would do that? They're like, well, don't want to say.
A lot of times you can't blame the architect. I mean, yes, some architects or some designs are to be blamed, but most of these things that are coming out within Lahore or within the country are products of the developer and not the architect himself or herself. Herself. And a lot of this is also responding to bylaws within certain areas, right? So, for instance, this is one thing that I really disagree with. The bylaw of kind of leaving 25 feet or 30 feet in the front, right? Which means like a front garden.
Yes.
Which is fine, except the front gardens are never usable because because we're private people.
Exactly.
And, there are guards and there's a lot of stuff happening.
You can't just have your children go out and play on that outside garden, which is just basically the road.
If the same thing was actually flipped over, it makes a lot more sense,
So a lot of ugly houses are developers.
I mean, ugly is a relative term. So.
I saw this
aesthetically, generally undispleasing.
I saw this rather wonderful house in Defense, and I use wonderful in the most wondrous term I can muster. It had 4 floors, a rooftop garden with rail grass, an elevator.
4 floors in Defense?
Yes, they somehow managed to squeeze that in.
This is a bylaw that doesn't allow you to do that.
It was crazy because the one sort of central space in this room had a 40-foot tall ceiling. There were metal bridges just spanning this room at various Harry Potter heights.
Oh dear!
And you managed to get inside?
Oh, because it was built by a developer, so it was a show house.
They're like, you too can rappel down from your roof.
No, I'm jealous. I wish
a waterfall that changes color inside the master bathroom. I mean, I've always wanted to have a client who wanted one of those.
I can't believe I missed out on this.
Yeah. Oh my God, I feel like my bathroom is really not living up to expectations.
And then we wonder why we don't get enough clients.
You're just not doing
our
waterfalls.
work is a little too subtle. I hate for waterfalls.
But speaking of subtle houses, let's sort of look at some pictures now of projects that Attiq has worked on. So, yes.
Well, this is actually not a project I've worked on, but a colleague, Raza Ali Dada. This is the Beacon House University's hostels that he just designed. I particularly love this building because of the use of jali, the open corridors, the breeze block.
Is that a breeze block?
That is actually a block cladding the water tanky and spaces under.
Okay.
Then this is a house that we did where we used the jali to great dramatic effect. Here, local vegetation has been used to create shadows and create a kind of a more intimate grotto space within the larger sort of...
And it really feels like a courtyard, like the old world kind of courtyard where the house is focused inwards.
It's so funny that you can be as modern as you want to be, but as long as you imbibe your space or your design with the memories of spaces that we might have grown up in, used or are familiar with, you remove that sterile sort of clinical quality from that architecture, which is, I think, an advantage, don't you think, Ayesha, that people like working in countries or contexts like Mexico or Hindustan or Pakistan, Sri Lanka, we actually have more of an advantage than actually where the school of thought actually comes from. Because that is kind of following a very industrial rationale. Okay, let's make things straightforward, streamlined, let's not lie about structure, let's be as straightforward as we can.
But what's lying about structure?
Cladding. Basically. Cladding is lying about structure.
When you build like a fiber sort of cement board, shadi plaza or hall or whatever they
Or you
call
make a brick
nowadays.
wall and you put plaster on top.
And then you marbleize it. Or,
okay.
exactly.
Oh.
Or
Alright, so you
worse,
sort of hide
pet
it.
peeve, you make a brick wall which is made in rough brick, and then you make another brick wall which is A-grade brick
What?
on
So you
top.
just have
Yes,
two
that
walls
is
stuck to
true.
each other.
That is true. That is what we do.
Why couldn't you just do A grade in the beginning?
I mean, exactly, right?
Oh, that raises costs.
As opposed to doing them together.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to show you guys another picture, which is the, that's so beautiful.
This is a rehabilitation job we did at Mayo Hospital with my colleagues at AEDL, which is the office that I run. And this was an interesting job because it was a 19th century building. We had to stay within the material palette already there and actually work within a really tight budget. Because, say, for
challenge
example,
upon
we
challenge.
couldn't remove the rotten timber beams.
Why? Wasn't that sort of hazardous to have them?
35-foot span beams that are braced together with metal that was made like in the 19th century. Very difficult to find a donor who would be willing to sort of,
Pay for
punch
those.
with that sort of.
But that's such a wonderful project because, again, it's such a public space. It's where people and patients are coming in all the time in a really high traffic kind of
It's the
environment.
busiest hospital in Lahore. In fact, all of Punjab, there are roughly 20,000 people that come there a day. It was designed for, guess how many people? 2,000.
Oh.
So there's a huge difference between what it can handle and what it is handling at the moment. I've been working with a do-gooding organization called Friends of Mayo Hospital. And I was brought on board by Nayyar Ali Dada because I'd already done some work when Ayesha was working with me at the office on Mayo Hospital. She'd helped document Newton Hall, and we tried our level best to save it, and we became acknowledged stakeholders by the health secretary at that time. But the building has now, have you seen it, Ayesha? They've just let people trees grow in the walls.
Yeah.
And
Which sounds romantic, but for a hospital, probably not the best.
no, it's actually,
option.
one keeps wondering why the nurses go on strike. If you actually see the condition these poor women are living in that hostel, or that hospital in general. I mean, I'm sure the hospital in Intizamiya will want to kill me right now, but actually...
We'll protect you. We'll sort of...
Are they planning an extension, Attiq?
They want to demolish it. They can't demolish it because, we're stakeholders as OCO, whatever. But the dealio is that it's a big parcel of land. So if you knock that building down, you can go 12 floors up and have about 300, 600 rooms.
Tell me about some of your favorite projects. I know that you've done a house was it a house in Nairobi?
I'm doing a house in Nairobi.
Oh, what's fun. So how was that? Sort of, it's obviously a completely different environment and it's a completely different
they're
brief.
completely different conditions, except my client has been living in Pakistan for, I want to say, about 15 years now. And he's very interested in taking what he thinks is Pakistani architecture to Nairobi.
What does he think is Pakistani architecture?
I mean, it's...
Are there
okay, so what the instructions I got?
Is there a
I love
waterfall? I really hope there is.
No, there's no waterfall. There's a swimming pool. There's a really nice pool. But he wanted basically, so there's a lot of rainfall in Nairobi.
Okay.
So they've got like pitched roofs and slanted roofs so that the rain can fall down easily. What he wanted was a flat roof. And he wanted the house to be very, very modern.
Okay.
So he'd kind of seen our work and I'd been talking about it a lot. And he wanted me to go for something very minimal, something that doesn't, disrupt the existing landscape.
Yeah.
And he was basically talking about the same sort of philosophy that I kind of pursue in my work. Something that's not very interfering, something that's not very imposing.
It's harmonious with
it's harmonious, and if you kind of make like a minimal intervention, then you let nature kind of respond to the rest of the design, which means that your architecture, your design is allowed to grow over a period of time.
That's really interesting. How does architecture grow over time?
What do you mean? How architecture
What does that
ages?
mean?
Buildings age. Buildings, like people settle in, people start using them in a particular way. there's a tree that grows that gives it shade in a particular angle that gives it a completely different character. I mean, there are multiple ways that houses grow.
I mean, one of the best examples is the basti between Miamir Pul and Sherpa Pul in Lahore, where you actually, I remember as a kid, it hardly used to exist because it wasn't sort of that tall.
Yeah.
But of course, one kid gets married, to chalo upar,
Ek aur
let's
story
add
bana
a
do.
floor above,
Right.
and then second kid's turn, so let's add another floor above. So that's how buildings age, and we adapt to them, and they adapt to us.
And I think a successful architecture is that's adaptable. You can't have something that's too rigid. That's not, you don't make space for yourself, or you don't make space for nature to kind of come in. Nature is
like
something
that
I think like
idea.
I've actually learned from you, like this kind of aspect of it.
I mean, I would go nuts if I don't see a tree.
I know, right?
And you know, it's just criminal thinking about the fact that Lahore since 2015 has lost 75% of its tree cover. And a city that used to pride itself on being a city of gardens
exactly.
is actually now suffering from one of the worst air qualities on earth.
Yeah.
And it's harrowing to think about the cost of respiratory illnesses to, say, an average
Oh, it's
family.
skyrocketed over the past 2 or 3 years.
And especially in children.
It has.
Why is every kid on a nebulizer? This is completely crazy. This is bad planning.
Yes. So again, it sort of boils down to good design, to sensible planning, to all of these factors which can mitigate a lot of suffering and a lot of inconvenience, to put it very mildly. And this is all, it's something that's entirely within the ambit of our talents. You know?
Right.
These are all things that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not like, well, it just happened and we don't know how to fix it.
I mean, I think it just requires a little bit of sensitivity and a little bit of intelligence. And if we just push those two factors forward.
And to sort of remember that urban planning is all about the people that one is planning for.
I mean,
and
inclusive
it's not
design.
Just a concept.
It is. It has to be inclusive design. You cannot leave people out of it.
Yes. So on this very thought-provoking note, we're going to wrap up the show. Thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I learned a lot, which was really great. I'm like, things age? How do architecture age? And I'm sure that all of you have had a wonderful time watching this. Sensible planning is the way forward. Remember that when you make your own houses. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time on The Coffee Table. Bye now.